At Keene's trading room, where miners and trappers gathered to talk and warm their hands, a man turned down $4 cash for a barrel of rancid bear fat. The storekeeper shrugged. The trapper leaning on the counter laughed loud enough for the room to hear. "Grease is for lamps and boots," the trapper said. "Not for heating a house. He will smoke himself black before he warms his hands." The man being laughed at did not answer. He paid for a length of wire, picked up a cracked iron pail from the scrap pile behind the store, and walked back up the mountain toward a cabin that held 3 logs and a stove that was already losing to the cold. February of 1887 had already taken 2 men from the Upper Animas drainage before the month was half spent. Ewan Mercer knew their names. Everyone above 9,000 feet knew their names, because names traveled faster than supply wagons in the San Juan country, and dead men's names traveled fastest of all. Ewan was 36 years old, Missouri-born, and he had come to Colorado not for silver, but for work. He had spent 4 years repairing mule team rigging and freight wagons for the Hollander Hauling Company out of Silverton, and he was good at it. Good enough that when Hollander collapsed after a ruinous season of washed-out roads and half-empty ore contracts, the outfit's remaining creditor offered Ewan a choice. Take the debt in cash, which meant nothing, because there was no cash. Or take a narrow claim cabin and a shed on the upper wagon road, which at least meant a roof. Ewan took the roof. He should not have. The cabin sat at the edge of viable territory, a single-room pine frame structure with mud chinking already pulling loose at the north wall. The shed leaned. The stove was a cast-iron box with a cracked loading door and a sliding draft plate that stuck at half open. The woodpile beside the south wall held 3 split pine logs and a scuttle of coal dust that would not fill a man's boot. $2.60 in coin sat in a tobacco tin on the shelf. His line of store credit at Keene's trading room had been cut off 3 weeks prior on account of the Hollander debt transferring to his name like a disease. None of that would have mattered if Ewan could have walked away. He could not walk away. His younger sister, Nell, lived in Durango with a daughter who had been sick since autumn, a chest illness that would not break, the kind that cost money every week in doctor's fees and camphor and clean cloth. Ewan had promised to sell hides and repaired tools by spring to cover the account. The claim cabin was the only collateral he could name. If he abandoned it, the creditor, a man named Calvin Strake, would take the property under abandonment terms, fold it into a timber access parcel, and sell it to a mine supply company that wanted the wagon road frontage. Nell's collateral would vanish. The doctor would stop coming. So Ewan stayed. He stayed in a cabin that could not keep him alive through what was coming. The storm announced itself on the afternoon of the 11th. Wind came first, hard and shifting, pressing snow sideways against the oiled paper window until the paper bowed inward. Then the temperature dropped so fast that the stovepipe cracked, a sharp metallic sound, like a rifle action closing, as the iron contracted. By dark, the world outside had become a white wall of moving noise. Ewan fed the stove and listened. He heard the avalanche before he understood it. A low sound, more felt than heard. A vibration that came up through the floor logs and made the water cup on the shelf shiver. Then a roar, distant but massive, rolling down from above the pass. The sound lasted 4 or 5 seconds and stopped. In the morning, the wagon road was gone. Not buried. Gone. A slab avalanche had crossed the cut between Ewan's cabin and the lower trail, snapping trees, smashing the footbridge across the creek, and depositing a wall of compacted snow and timber debris that rose higher than a man on horseback. The drainage line that Ewan sometimes followed to reach the lower valley had vanished under drifts. The nearest occupied cabin, Ansel Pike's trapping shelter, sat roughly 6 miles away by Summer Trail. In winter, through chest-deep snow, across avalanche debris, with no snowshoes strong enough for the drifted timber, 6 miles was a death sentence. Ewan stood at his door and looked at the white silence and understood that no one was coming. No one knew whether his cabin had been struck or spared. No one would risk the upper road until the weather broke, and the weather was not breaking. He went back inside. He looked at the 3 logs beside the stove. 3 logs. Rufus Bell had tried to warn him. That was the bitter part. Rufus was 58 years old, a former Union teamster who had come west after the war and built himself into the most trusted road boss between Silverton and the smaller claims. When Rufus said a route was closed, men turned their wagons around. When Rufus said a storm was 3 days out, families sealed their chinking and hauled water. He had buried enough people to know what carelessness looked like, and when he rode up to Ewan's cabin 2 days before the avalanche, he did not bother with pleasantries. Rufus swung down from his mule, walked past Ewan without greeting, and stood in front of the woodpile. He counted aloud. Then he walked inside, touched the stove, opened the draft plate, closed it, examined the chimney collar where soot had caked, and came back out. "You have 3 logs," Rufus said, "half a scuttle of coal crumbs, and a stove that eats pine like paper." Ewan said nothing. "A man needs a cord stacked dry for a week like this, not scraps." Rufus pointed at the north wall, where frost had begun to form on the inside chinking. "That wall sweats. Your pipe is thin. The draft plate sticks. If you smothered a full log to stretch it, you might get 40 minutes. Maybe. But without a proper coal bed underneath, you will not hold heat past midnight." "I know what I have, Rufus." "Then you know what you don't have." Rufus pulled his collar tighter. The wind had shifted while they talked. "1 pine log burns hard for 20 minutes if you open the draft. Longer if you choke it, but with less heat. 3 logs gives you an hour of real warmth, maybe 2 if you nurse them. After that, the cabin becomes a box of cold iron, and cold iron kills as surely as a blade." He looked at Ewan the way a man looks at a decision he cannot change. "You cannot cut wood. The deadfall is buried under 6 feet of snow, and your axe head is cracked. You cannot reach town. You cannot burn furniture because you own a bunk, a shelf, and a stool, and that gives you maybe 30 minutes more. You cannot rely on rescue because no one knows whether this cabin was hit or missed." Rufus paused. "And you cannot walk out. Not through that drainage, not in those boots." Ewan felt the words settle into his body like cold water. He already knew every number Rufus had spoken. He had done the calculation himself, but hearing it from the one man in the district whose calculations were never wrong made the math heavier. "Come down with me," Rufus said. "I have room. If I leave, Strake takes the claim." "Strake can take a frozen man's claim just as easily." "Not if I am still in it." Rufus stared at him for a long time. Then he mounted his mule and turned it downhill. Over his shoulder he said, "I will try to send someone when the road opens, but the road may not open for a week, maybe more." He did not say what they both knew. A week without fuel in this cabin was not a week. It was a coffin with a chimney. Ewan watched the mule disappear into the tree line and went inside. He shut the door. He put the first of the 3 logs into the stove and listened to the fire take hold. The sound of burning wood had always been a comfort. Now it sounded different. It sounded like a clock. The idea did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as an accident, a smell, and a memory. On the second morning after the avalanche sealed the road, the cabin had cooled to the point where Ewan's breath hung visible even beside the stove. He had burned 1 log through the night, rationing it with the draft plate nearly closed, and the second log was now down to a fist-sized coal that pulsed dull orange when the wind pressed against the chimney cap. The 3rd log sat beside the stove, the last log. Ewan reached for it, and his glove caught the edge of the stovetop. The glove was old leather, stiff and cracked, and sometime in the past weeks a smear of bear grease had worked into the seam near the thumb. When the glove touched the hot iron, the grease liquefied. A single drop ran from the leather onto the stove surface. It smoked. It spat. Then, for a half second, it flared, a small bright tongue of yellow flame that rose and vanished. Ewan pulled his hand back. The flare had been dangerous. He knew that. Grease on a hot stove was how cabin fires started. But the image would not leave. The grease had burned. Not slowly, like a wick. Fiercely, instantly, like it had been waiting for permission, and the stove was already hot. The barrel sat against the far wall between the bunk and the door. 40 gallons of rendered bare fat mixed with kitchen grease, waste from a hunting camp and a season of rough cooking, bought for almost nothing at the end of autumn because nobody wanted rancid fat. Ewan had planned to use it for boot waterproofing, leather treatment, and lamp oil through the winter. The smell kept it shoved against the wall where the air was coldest. Even there, it smelled like something dead and burned at the same time. Now Ewan stared at the barrel as if seeing it for the first time. The stove was hot. The grease burned on hot iron. The barrel held 35 gallons of something that wanted to burn. But the logic crumbled the moment he thought past the flash. Dumping grease into a hot stove was suicide. A ladle of liquid fat hitting a coal bed would smother the fire or erupt into an uncontrollable blaze. Burning it in a lamp wick gave light and a trace of warmth, nothing more. The energy in the barrel was real, he had seen it flash, but the energy needed to arrive at the iron slowly, in amounts the stove could handle. That was when Torsten Brecke came back to him. Not alive. Torsten had died the previous autumn, coughing blood into a rag in his rented room above the assay office. A 64-year-old Norwegian blacksmith whose lungs had finally surrendered to decades of coal dust and forge smoke. But Torsten's voice, Torsten's hands, Torsten's patience with fire, those had not died. They lived in the places where Ewan had stored them. Muscle memory, habit, and the kind of understanding that does not need words because it was learned through watching, not listening. Ewan had met Torsten 3 years earlier when the old man was still working the repair forge at a railroad siding outside Durango. Ewan had brought a cracked wheel rim, and instead of haggling over price, he had stood and watched Torsten work for an hour. The old man noticed. Most people who brought broken iron wanted it fixed fast and cheap. This one wanted to understand why it broke. Torsten had let him stay. Over the next 2 years, whenever Ewan passed through, he stopped at the forge. He never became a blacksmith. But he learned what Torsten considered the only lesson worth teaching. Fire is not made. Fire is governed. The memory that surfaced now was specific. A winter afternoon, the forge running low on coal, and Torsten demonstrating how a small fire could be kept alive through draft discipline and fuel placement. He had taken a scrap of rendered fat and placed it on a flat piece of iron resting on the coal bed. The fat melted, smoked, then burned with a steady flame that lasted as long as the fat lasted. "Too much air wastes heat," Torsten had said, cupping his cracked palm near the draft opening. "Too little kills it. The fire does not care about your hurry. It cares about contact, air, and patience." Ewan had filed that lesson the way a man files a tool he does not yet need. Now, standing in a freezing cabin with one log left and a barrel of grease he could not safely burn, the lesson came back with the force of something urgent. Contact, air, patience. If the grease arrived at the stove not as a flood but as a drip, one drop at a time, each drop meeting iron hot enough to flash it into flame, then each drop became a tiny surge of heat, not enough to warm a room, but enough to keep the iron hot. And if the iron stayed hot, the next drop would flash, and the next, and the next. The fire would not roar, it would tick, drop, flash, heat, drop, flash, heat, a pulse instead of a blaze. But the delivery was everything. Too fast and the grease would pool, smoke, smother, or erupt. Too slow, and the iron would cool between drops until the grease only smeared and smoked without catching. The window between too much and too little was narrow, and Ewan had no way to know how narrow until he tried. He looked at the last log. He looked at the barrel. He looked at the stove. If he did nothing, he froze. If he tried too much grease, he burned or choked. If he tried too little, the cabin cooled past recovery. Every option carried death. Only one option carried a chance. He opened the barrel. The rancid smell hit him like a hand across the face. Under the hardened crust, the fat was dark and thick, layered with old cooking grease and flecked with charred bits that had settled to the bottom. It was not clean tallow. It was not lamp oil. It was the cheapest, foulest fuel he could imagine, and his life was about to depend on it. Ewan started small. He scooped a spoonful of grease from the barrel, warmed it between his palms until it softened, and held it over the stove top. He tilted the spoon. A single drop fell. It smoked. A wisp of gray that stung his eyes. Then it caught. A small flare, bright and brief, gone in a second. He tried again. 2 drops in quick succession. The first smoked, the second flared, and for a moment the stovetop brightened. He tried a third time with a bent scrap of tin that he could angle more precisely. 3 drops spaced a breath apart. Smoke, smoke, flare. The last drop burned long enough that he felt heat on his fingers, holding the tin above the surface. The problem was control. His hand shook from cold. The grease thickened the moment it moved away from his body heat. The drops fell unevenly, nothing for 10 seconds. Then a clot that landed too heavy and smothered itself in soot. He needed something that would deliver grease without requiring his hand to hover over a hot stove. He thought of the pail. Under the bunk, among the debris of his abbreviated life, sat a small iron pail, cracked along one side, useless for hauling water, but still iron. Ewan turned it over. If he could punch a small hole in the bottom and suspend the pail above the stove, gravity would pull the grease through the hole at a rate determined by the hole's size and the grease's thickness. His hand would not need to be there. The system would feed itself. He used Torsten's old forge awl, the one tool the old man had given him outright, saying only, "A man should own one thing that can make holes in the world," to punch a hole in the pail's bottom. The hole was rough, the size of a nail head. Too big, and grease would pour. Too small, and cold grease would plug it. He would not know until he tried. Baling wire from a feed sack bundle gave him a way to hang the pail. He twisted 2 lengths, looped them through the pail's rim, and suspended it from a roof spike that sat within arm's reach of the stove. The pail hung about 8 inches above the stovetop, swinging slightly whenever he moved near it. He scraped a handful of grease from the barrel, softened it, dropped it into the pail. Nothing happened. The grease sat in the pail, too thick and cold to flow through the hole. Ewan swore under his breath. He moved the pail closer to the stove, letting the rising heat warm the iron. After a minute, the grease inside began to soften. He tilted the pail gently to push the grease toward the hole. A drop formed, hung, fell. It hit the stove top and smoked. Another drop formed. This one fell faster. It hit the iron and flared, a small, angry snap of yellow, then another. The rhythm was uneven, unpredictable, but the drops were falling, and they were burning. The cabin smelled terrible. The smoke was thick, greasy, and tasted like old meat. Ewan's eyes watered, but the stovetop, which had been cooling toward darkness, brightened. The iron held color. The next drop fell, and the flare lasted longer than the last. Then the chimney coughed. A gust of wind pressed down the pipe, and the smoke that should have risen was pushed back into the room. Black soot and greasy vapor rolled across the ceiling. Ewan's lungs seized. He dropped to his knees where the air was cleaner and felt for the draft plate. He shoved it wider. The smoke swirled, hesitated, and then the chimney pulled again. The room began to clear, but the pail had swung during the commotion, and the hole had shifted off-center from the stovetop. 2 drops of grease landed on the stove side and ran down the iron into the coal bed below. They flared hard, a brightness that made Ewan flinch and then guttered out. The system was fragile. 1 gust, 1 bump, 1 degree of temperature change, and the balance between burning and smothering shifted. Ewan was not heating a cabin. He was negotiating with fire, 1 drop at a time, and fire was not a patient negotiator. He repositioned the pail. He adjusted the wire. He thought about Torsten saying, "The fire does not care about your hurry." Another drop fell. Smoke, then flame. He fed the last log into the stove beneath the drip point, building a coal bed that would keep the iron hot enough to flash the grease. The log would last maybe 20 minutes at full draft. In those 20 minutes, he needed to establish a drip rate that could sustain heat after the wood was ash. 20 minutes. Everything he had left in the world, measured in burning pine. While Ewan fought his private war against cold and physics inside the cabin, the weeks before the avalanche had already pronounced their verdict in the voices of his neighbors. Keen's trading room sat at a junction of 2 wagon tracks below the upper claims, a long, low building with a plank counter, a sheet iron stove, and the permanent smell of tobacco and wet wool. Men came in after daylight and stayed until someone needed to feed stock. Women came less often and stayed less long. Everyone talked. Ewan had been to Keen's 8 days before the storm, looking for baling wire, a cracked iron pail, and the kind of small iron hardware that cost almost nothing because nobody else wanted it. He had also been seen refusing to sell the rancid bear fat barrel when old Keen himself offered to buy it at soap-rendering price, 12 cents a gallon, which would have given Ewan more than $4. Ewan had said no. $4 was food, $4 was credit, $4 was the difference between buying nails and not buying nails, and Ewan had turned it down for 40 gallons of fat that smelled like a dead animal in a hot room. Ansel Pike had been leaning against the counter when it happened. Ansel was 41, a trapper with a practical mind and no patience for anything that could not be skinned, dried, or traded at a profit. He liked Ewan well enough. They had shared a meal once after a trail washout stranded them both, but liking a man did not mean trusting his judgment. "Grease is for lamps and boots, not for heating a house," Ansel said, loud enough for the room. "He will smoke himself black before he warms his hands." Laughter. Not cruel laughter. The kind of laughter that comes from men who have seen a dozen schemes fail for everyone that works, and who have learned that cleverness kills as often as it saves. The mountain did not care how smart a man thought he was. Ewan did not explain. He knew the idea was unproven. A half-explained method becomes ridicule before it becomes proof. He paid for the wire, took the cracked pail from a scrap pile behind the store, and left. But Ansel's words carried. By the time Ewan reached his cabin, 2 other men had heard the story. By nightfall, the general consensus in the district was that Ewan Mercer was either planning something foolish or had already lost enough sense to refuse good money for bad grease. Calvin Strake heard the story, too. Strake heard everything that happened in the upper drainage because Strake held paper on half the claims between the Anima's Forks and the timberline. He was 46 years old, well-dressed for the district, and he had the particular gift of making reasonable offers that left the other party with nothing. He had acquired Ewan's note from the Hollander collapse at a discount and had already calculated what the cabin and shed were worth as part of a larger timber and access parcel. Strake found Ewan at the woodpile, such as it was, 2 days before the storm. "I heard you turned down cash for grease," Strake said. He did not dismount. Men like Strake rarely dismounted unless there was a contract to sign. Ewan kept splitting kindling from a scrap board. The axe head was cracked, and each stroke had to be measured so the crack would not spread. A man who cannot afford wood cannot afford land, Strake said. Then I will burn what I have. Grease won't save a roof. Maybe not yours. Strake's expression did not change. He had the patience of a man who understood that winter did his negotiating for him. I can take the claim before spring if you leave. You know that. Abandonment is abandonment, Mercer, but I'm offering you a choice. Sell me the note now, 50 cents on the dollar. You walk away clean, take what you can carry, and your sister has a chance to find another way. Ewan stopped splitting. He looked up at Strake, still mounted, still dry, still wearing gloves that had never touched an axe handle. My sister's collateral is this cabin, Ewan said. If I sell it to you for half of nothing, she gets half of nothing. If I stay, she keeps the only claim I can put my name to. If you freeze, she gets nothing at all. Then I had better not freeze. Strake gathered his reins. You're heating a mortgage with kitchen slop, Mercer. The mountain does not care about your good intentions. He turned his horse downhill. Ewan heard the hooves fade against frozen ground and felt the silence that followed press against the cabin walls like another kind of cold. That night, Strake spoke to the storekeeper at Keen's. No more credit for Ewan Mercer, not a nail, not a pound of flour, not an inch of rope. The word spread without announcement, the way financial death always spreads in small places, through a shake of the head, a regretful shrug, a murmured, "His account is closed." No one volunteered to haul a cord of wood to the upper cabin before the storm. Nobody extended a hand. Rufus warned him. Ansel mocked him. Strake starved him. And then the first hard snow came against the windows, and the mountain closed its hand. Inside the sealed cabin, with the last log burning and the pail swinging overhead, Ewan worked. The first hour after he hung the pail was the ugliest hour of his life. The grease clotted in the cold iron and plugged the hole 3 times. Each time, he had to lift the pail, clear the blockage with the awl, and rehang it, losing heat from the open draft, losing position, losing time. The drops that did fall were unpredictable, nothing for a full minute, then 3 at once. When 3 came together, the flare rose high enough to lick the underside of the pail, which heated the grease above too fast, which sent 4 more drops in rapid succession, which created a bloom of smoke thick enough to blind him. He coughed until his ribs hurt. His eyes burned. The cabin air tasted like a rendering shed. But Torsten's voice was in the room. Not literally, not as a ghost or comfort, as a discipline. Rhythm over force, Torsten had said once, explaining why a steady hand at the bellows beat frantic pumping. The fire does not reward panic. Ewan forced himself to slow down. He stopped trying to feed the pail when the drops failed and started watching the cycle instead. When the pail cooled and the grease thickened, the drops slowed. When the stove heat rose and warmed the pail, the drops quickened. The system had its own rhythm, and his job was not to override it but to work within it. He moved the barrel farther from the stove so the reserve would not heat and soften prematurely. He carried only a small working amount to the pail, less than a cup at a time, scraped from under the rancid crust, and strained through a scrap of cloth to catch the hardened chunks that would plug the hole. The cloth was not a filter. It was a prayer in fabric form, but it caught enough. He learned to read the smoke. Thin gray meant the drop was flashing clean, contact good, air sufficient, heat adequate. Thick black meant the grease was pooling, too much, too fast, the iron not hot enough to consume it. White smoke with a sharp smell meant the grease was overheating in the pail, breaking down before it fell. Each color told him something, and each something required a different adjustment. Draft plate wider for black smoke, draft plate narrower for white. Leave it alone for gray. His fingertips split open from the cold. The skin between his thumb and forefinger, where he gripped the wire to adjust the pail, cracked and bled. The blood froze against the metal. He wrapped his hands in cloth torn from the edge of the bunk blanket and kept working. The wall frost near the stove retreated. 2-finger widths of dry wood appeared around the stovepipe collar. Then the frost crept back when a gust knocked the drip off rhythm and the fire thinned. He rebuilt. He adjusted. He waited. The first log was gone. The second was down to coals the size of a child's fist, glowing deep orange when the draft fed them, fading when it did not. The grease strip was sustaining heat, barely, but only because the coal bed gave the iron enough base temperature to flash each drop. When the coals died, the iron would cool. When the iron cooled, the drops would smoke instead of flare. When the drops stopped flaring, the cabin would begin its final descent into the temperature outside. And outside, the thermometer, if he had owned one, would have read somewhere near 20 degrees below zero. Ewan placed the third log on the coals, the last piece of wood he owned in the world. Pine, split rough, rimed with frost that hissed when it met the heat. He had 20 minutes of wood left, maybe less. In those 20 minutes, the coal bed had to grow hot enough to sustain the iron after the wood was gone. The drip had to find its rhythm. The draft had to balance. The chimney had to pull. Everything he had learned from Torsten, from failure, from the terrible education of the past hours came down to this: a man, a pail, a stove, a log, and a drop of grease falling through cold air toward hot iron. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by people who could only see the risk, not the reason you kept working? The log caught. The fire climbed. The pail warmed. The next drop formed at the hole, hung for a breath, and fell. It hit the stove and burned. Ewan counted. Drop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hiss. Drop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hiss. The rhythm was not perfect. The rhythm did not need to be perfect. It needed to be alive. Outside, the wind found a new angle against the chimney and pressed. Inside, the fire answered with a sound that was not roaring and not silence. It was a pulse, a negotiation, a heartbeat made of grease and iron, and the memory of a dead blacksmith who had taught him that fire was not something a man owned. It was something he borrowed. The third log was burning, the drip was falling, and the cold, patient as a creditor, was waiting to see which would last. The third log burned for 23 minutes by Ewan's count, and his count was rough, measured in breaths, not seconds, because a man who cannot feel his feet does not track time precisely. But the 23 minutes did what they needed to do. The coal bed deepened. The stove body absorbed heat through its iron walls and held it the way Torsten had said iron holds things, unevenly, reluctantly, but with a stubbornness that outlasts the fire that made it hot. When the last flame of pine collapsed into a bed of red coals, the drip was falling. Drop. Hiss. A small flare on the stovetop lasting a half second. Then nothing. Then another drop. Another flare. The coals beneath the stove grate kept the iron warm enough to flash each drop. But coals do not last forever, and pine coals last less than most. Ewan watched the red light under the grate dim over the next hour, like a lantern being carried away down a long hall. Every few minutes, the grate lost another shade of brightness, the iron above it cooled by fractions. Each fraction meant the next drop needed to be slightly larger to flash, or the iron needed to be slightly hotter. Neither was something he could demand. He was in the window now, the space between the coal bed dying and the drip sustaining itself. If the iron cooled past the flash point before the drip's own combustion could maintain surface temperature, the system would fail. Drops would land on warm iron instead of hot iron. They would smoke, pool, and smother. And once the stove went cold, he had nothing left to restart it. No wood, no coal, no second chance. He adjusted the draft plate a quarter-inch wider. More air reached the fading coals and drew the last heat upward through the grate into the stove body. The iron brightened, barely. The next drop fell and flared cleanly, but the wider draft also pulled more cabin heat up the chimney. The temperature in the room, already brutal, dropped another degree. Ewan felt it in his jaw. The muscles along his cheekbones tightened, and his teeth began to ache, a deep, bone-cold ache that had nothing to do with his teeth and everything to do with the air around them. He narrowed the draft. The coals dimmed. The next drop smoked instead of flaring. He widened it again. The coals caught breath. The drop flared. This was the negotiation. Not a single decision, but a continuous one. A conversation between air and iron and grease that required his attention the way a sick animal requires a hand on its chest, not to heal it, but to feel whether it was still breathing. The hours became a discipline. Every 30 counts. 1, 2, 3, up to 30, then start again. Ewan checked 3 things: the drip, the draft, and the smoke. If the drip had slowed, the pail had cooled, and he needed to nudge it closer to the stove or add warmer grease. If the draft was pulling too hard, the chimney sound changed from a low hum to a thin whistle, and he slid the plate back. If the smoke thickened, the grease was pooling, and he tapped the pail wire to break the surface tension at the hole. He developed a working rhythm. Every 30 counts, he checked. Every 60 counts, he fed the pail. A spoonful of grease scraped from the barrel, strained through the cloth, pressed into the pail with his thumb. Every 120 counts, he crawled to the barrel and assessed the reserve. The barrel was his calendar, 35 usable gallons beneath the rancid crust. Each spoonful was roughly a tablespoon. Each feeding was 2 spoonfuls. At one feeding every 60 counts, and each count roughly 2 seconds. He was consuming grease at a rate that his cold-numbed mind could not quite calculate, but his gut told him was slow enough. The barrel would outlast him if the system held. The question was whether the system would hold. Torsten's second lesson arrived through the stove itself. In the 4th hour, the drip faltered. Not because the grease stopped flowing, but because the stove body had developed a cold spot, a section of iron on the left side, away from the chimney that had cooled faster than the rest. When the pail swung slightly on its wire, drops that landed on the cold spot did not flash. They pooled. The pool smoked. The smoke thickened the air without producing heat. Ewan remembered Torsten holding a hand over different parts of a forge bed, feeling for the places where heat gathered and the places where it leaked. "Iron lies unless it is hot all through," Torsten had said. "A cold spot in a forge is a dead spot. Work around it or heat through it, but do not pretend it is not there." Ewan could not heat through the cold spot with fuel he did not have, but he could work around it. He repositioned the pail wire so the hole hung directly over the hottest section of the stovetop, the area closest to the chimney collar, where rising draft kept the iron warmest. The drops now fell on metal that was a full shade brighter than the dead section to the left. The flares returned, small, steady, alive. But the repositioning meant the pail hung at an angle, and the grease inside shifted toward the lower edge, making the flow less predictable. 3 drops in quick succession, then a pause. 2 drops, then a longer pause. The rhythm was ragged, and ragged rhythm meant ragged heat. Ewan bent a second piece of wire into a crude cradle that held the pail more level. It was ugly work. His fingers were split and clumsy, the wire stiff, but it held. The drops evened out. Not perfect. Close enough. He had been working for 6 hours. His throat burned from smoke. His shirt was frozen where sweat had soaked through and reached the outer cloth. The cabin smelled like a tannery set on fire inside a smokehouse. Every surface within arm's reach of the stove was slicked with a thin film of grease vapor that had condensed on the cold wood and iron. He had not eaten. He had a tin of hardtack and a strip of dried elk on the shelf, but chewing required attention, and attention was the only currency he had left. Every 30 counts. Check the drip, check the draft, check the smoke. If he stopped counting, he stopped watching. If he stopped watching, the fire died. Under the bunk, where he had shoved it months ago, was Torsten's old folded note. The old man had left it after repairing a cracked stove leg the previous summer, tucked under a loose floorboard the way Torsten tucked things without announcement, without expectation of thanks. Ewan had found it weeks later and had not unfolded it because the handwriting was difficult and the light was poor and there was always something more urgent. Now he unfolded it. The paper was soft with age and damp. The words were in Torsten's careful, foreign hand, each letter formed separately like a man who had learned English writing as a second craft. Iron lies unless it is hot all through. The same words, written before they were spoken, left in a cabin that would need them before it knew why. Ewan pressed the note flat against his knee and put it in his shirt pocket close to his chest, where his body would keep the paper warm even if nothing else stayed warm. By the end of the first full day, the system was not reliable. It was something worse and something better. It was possible. The stove had not gone cold. The drip had not stopped. The cabin had not warmed to anything a reasonable person would call comfortable. Ewan's breath still clouded. The north wall still wept frost, and the water cup on the shelf remained a solid block of ice. But the air within 6 feet of the stove had changed. It had crossed a line from killing cold to endurable cold, the kind a man could survive if he did not sleep deeply and did not stop moving his fingers and did not stop counting. Drop. Hiss. Flare. Count to 5. Drop. Hiss. Flare. The stovetop held a color that Torsten would have called cherry dull, not bright, not dark, the color of iron that had accepted heat without surrendering to it. Each drop of grease that landed on that surface flashed into a brief yellow flame, consumed itself, and left a faint residue of carbon that the next drop burned through. The iron stayed hot because the drip kept feeding it. The drip kept flowing because the iron stayed hot enough to warm the pail above it. The two processes held each other in a mutual dependence that was as fragile as it was functional. The wall frost near the stove had retreated and held. A patch of dry wood, perhaps 18 inches across, surrounded the stovepipe collar like a clearing in a forest of ice. Beyond that clearing, the frost owned everything. Ewan allowed himself one swallow of water, melted ice from the cup's edge, tasting of iron and smoke. His fingers found the hardtack tin. He ate half a cracker standing beside the stove, counting between bites, watching the drip, reading the smoke. The wind outside had not stopped. He could hear it finding the gaps in the chinking, pressing cold fingers through the mud where it had cracked, pushing against the door with a steady pressure that made the hinges creak. The chimney sang a low, unsteady note that changed pitch when the gusts shifted. Every shift meant a change in draft. Every change in draft meant an adjustment to the plate. But the fire held. Not comfortably, not safely. Held the way a man holds a rope over a canyon with everything he has, knowing that holding is not the same as climbing, and that the real test has not come yet. The real test came on the second night. The temperature outside had been dropping since dusk, and by full dark the cold had found a depth that changed the rules. Ewan felt it first in the stove. The iron that had been holding cherry dull dimmed to a darker shade, not because the drip had slowed, but because the cold was pulling heat from the metal faster than the grease could replace it. The stove was losing a war of rates, heat in versus heat out, and the cold had reinforced. The wind shifted to the north and drove snow against the chimney side of the cabin with a sound like sand thrown against a drum. The flue began to cough. Not the occasional backdraft he had handled before. A persistent, rhythmic choking, as if the chimney itself was struggling to breathe. Snow was packing against the cap, narrowing the exit, and the smoke that should have risen was looking for other ways out. Ewan opened the draft plate wider. The smoke thinned, but the cold air that rushed in to replace it was a knife. The cabin temperature, already lethal beyond the stove's reach, dropped another notch. He could feel the frost line advancing, not see it in the dark, but feel it in the way the air thickened, and the wall nearest him grew a new layer of damp. Then the drip slowed. The pail had cooled. The grease inside, which had been flowing in a reluctant but steady rhythm, thickened as the air temperature dropped. The drops that fell were smaller, slower, farther apart. Each one still flared when it hit the iron, but the intervals between flares stretched, and in those intervals the stove cooled by fractions. Ewan reached for the barrel to warm more grease and carry it to the pail. He stood, turned, and his boot hit a patch of condensed grease on the floor. His ankle folded. The pain was immediate, a bright spike that ran from his ankle to his knee and dropped him sideways. He caught the bunk frame with one hand and kept himself from falling into the stove, but his weight came down on the twisted ankle and the spike became a wave. He slid to the floor, breathing hard, his vision swimming with pain and smoke. He could not stand on the ankle. He tested it, and the joint gave a grinding protest that told him it was not broken, but badly wrenched. He could crawl. He could drag himself between barrel, pail, stove, and door, but he could not move quickly, and the system he had built required adjustments that happened in seconds. The drip was still falling, but the rhythm had stretched to dangerous intervals. The iron was cooling. Ewan crawled to the stove, pulled himself up on the stove side, burning the heel of his palm on the hot metal, and reached for the pail. He lifted it from its wire, held it close to the stove body to warm the grease inside, and rehung it. The drops quickened, but the chimney coughed again, harder this time, and smoke rolled back into the room in a thick wave that filled the space from ceiling to chest height. Ewan dropped flat. The air below knee level was still breathable, dirty, greasy, cold, but breathable. Above that line was poison. He had to clear the chimney. The chimney cap was outside, unreachable, but the lower flue section, where it met the stovepipe collar, had a clean-out gap, a space where soot could be scraped and the pipe examined. If soot and ice were narrowing the draw, he could clear some from the inside. He reached up from the floor and found the lower plate of the stovepipe collar. The metal was hot enough to burn through the cloth wrapping his hand. He pulled his sleeve over his fingers, gripped the plate, and worked it loose. Soot fell, a cascade of black flakes and greasy crust that covered his face and arms and hissed where it landed on the stovetop. The chimney gasped. A sudden upward pull, strong enough to make the fire flare and the pail swing. Smoke rushed toward the newly opened passage, and the room began to clear. Ewan shoved the plate back into place, coughing, his eyes streaming, his burned palm throbbing. The air tasted like hot iron and rancid fat and charred wood, and it was the best air he had ever breathed because it meant the chimney was drawing again. But the commotion had cost him. The pail had swung wide during the pipe work, and 3 drops had fallen on the cold section of the stove, the dead spot he had avoided for hours. They pooled, smoked, and did not flash. The iron's temperature had dropped while the pipe was open, and the draft surge had pulled cabin heat up the chimney along with the smoke. The room was colder than it had been at any point since the system started. Ewan repositioned the pail. His ankle screamed when he shifted weight. His palm bled where the hot plate had cooked it through the cloth. The frost line was advancing. He could see it now in the dim orange light from the stove, a wet line creeping across the wall toward him like a tide. He fed the pail. He adjusted the draft. He waited. Somewhere near midnight, he had no clock, only the depth of silence that told him the world outside had stopped pretending to be anything but hostile. He heard a sound. A bell. Faint. Irregular. Metal on metal, carried on the wind in fragments. His heart lurched. A bell meant a mule. A mule meant a rider. A rider meant rescue. He dragged himself to the door, cracked it open against the snow that had packed against the lower hinge, and listened. The cold that poured through the gap was staggering, a physical force that hit his chest and stole the air from his lungs. The frost line, which had been retreating near the stove, leaped forward 6 inches in the seconds the door was open. The bell sounded again, closer, then farther, then nothing. Ewan listened for 5 minutes. The door cracked, the cabin bleeding heat, the stove struggling against the cold river pouring across the floor. No voice followed the bell, no hooves, no call. It was not rescue. It was a lost mule bell, torn from a freight animal, perhaps Keen's daughter Mara's team, now swinging on a buried branch in the wind. A piece of metal pretending to be hope. He closed the door. The effort of closing it, with the snow packed against the lower hinge, made him put weight on his ankle, and the pain doubled him over. He fell against the bunk and lay there, breathing in short bursts, feeling the cold reclaim every inch the stove had won. The false hope was worse than no hope. His body had spent something, adrenaline, will, whatever the resource was that kept a man crawling between barrel and stove in a smoke-filled room, and the spending left him emptier than he had been before. For the first time since the avalanche, Ewan considered the possibility that this was how it ended, not in a dramatic collapse, in a slow surrender, the drip falling on cooling iron, the iron failing to flash, the grease pooling, the smoke thickening, and a man too tired and too hurt to make the next adjustment. He lay on the bunk and watched the stove from a distance of 4 feet. The drip fell. The iron did not flash. The drip fell again. A thin wisp of smoke, no flame. The third drop hit the stovetop and lay there, a small dark circle on dimming metal, refusing to burn. The coal bed had collapsed. The last pine coal, which had been feeding baseline heat to the iron for hours, had finally broken apart into ash. Without that foundation, the stove body was cooling from beneath, and the drip, which needed surface temperature above the flash point of the grease, was landing on iron that no longer had enough heat to ignite it. Ewan watched the 4th drop fall. Smoke. No flame. He had minutes, maybe less. If the iron cooled past the flash point, no amount of grease would bring it back. He would need fire. He had no fire. The stove would become what Rufus had predicted, a box of cold iron and a box of cold wood, and the cold would take him before dawn. Torsten's voice came back, not as comfort, as instruction, a memory from the forge in Durango, a November day, sleet against the smithy walls, the coal nearly spent. Torsten had banked the forge, reduced the fire to almost nothing, a glow so dim it looked dead. A customer walked in and thought the forge was cold. Torsten had not corrected him. He had simply adjusted the draft, a fractional opening barely a finger's width, and waited. After a full minute of what looked like nothing, the coal bed flushed red. The forge was not dead. It was sleeping. And sleeping fire, Torsten said, wastes less than waking fire. Lower the feed, Torsten's voice said in Ewan's memory. Steady the draft. Let the iron remember. Ewan rolled off the bunk and crawled to the stove. He slid the draft plate to nearly closed. A crack. Nothing more. The whisper of air entering the stove dropped to almost silence. Then he adjusted the pail wire, pulling it slightly away from the stove so the grease cooled fractionally and the drops fell smaller, lighter, slower. He waited. The stove made no sound. The room made no sound. The wind outside had paused, as if the mountain itself was watching. A drop fell. It hit the iron. Nothing. Another drop. It hit the same spot, the spot where the previous drops had laid down a thin film of unburned grease. The film was still warm, barely, but warm enough that the new drop did not cool it further. Another drop. The film thickened. The iron beneath it held a thread of heat, not enough to flash the grease, but enough to keep it liquid rather than solid. The liquid spread across the hot spot in a thin layer, absorbing heat from below and above. Ewan held his breath. The layer flashed. Not a single drop flaring. The entire thin film igniting at once. A blue-yellow shimmer that raced across the wet spot on the stovetop and consumed the accumulated grease in a single clean pulse. The pulse lasted 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, the iron beneath absorbed enough heat to bring the surface back above the flash point. The next drop fell. It flared instantly, clean, sharp, a snap of yellow against dull iron. The next drop, another flare. The rhythm returned. Not the same rhythm, slower, thinner, more fragile, but alive. The stove was not roaring. It was not comfortable. It was ticking. Each tick was a drop meeting iron that remembered how to be hot, and each tick kept the memory alive for the next. If you're invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because the next few minutes decide whether Ewan has built a furnace or a coffin. Ewan did not celebrate. The chimney coughed again, lighter this time, and he cleared it by tapping the lower collar until soot fell. His burned hand leaked fluid through the cloth. His ankle had swollen inside his boot to the point where removing the boot would mean not getting it back on. He stopped considering the boot. He fed the pail. He watched the drops. He counted. Miles below, on the lower trail, Rufus Bell's rescue party had stopped for the night. They were 7 men, 2 mules, and a dog that belonged to nobody in particular, but followed Rufus the way practical creatures follow competent men. The snow had forced them into a collapsed line shack at the edge of a logging cut, where they built a fire from green timber and wet kindling and produced more smoke than heat. 2 miners who had been sheltering in the shack before the party arrived had nearly suffocated trying to burn the same green wood. One had fled into the snow and been found unconscious 30 yards downhill, face down in a drift, his fingers already black at the tips. The other had stayed inside, wrapped in a horse blanket, breathing through a wet rag, and survived by abandoning the fire entirely and relying on body heat and the blanket. Both would live, but the one with the black fingers would lose 3 of them. Rufus looked at the greenwood fire and thought about Ewan Mercer's cabin, higher up, more exposed, with 3 logs and a barrel of rancid grease. He did not say what he thought. What he thought was that Ewan Mercer was already frozen. Marakeen, 19, was with the party because she knew the winter trail better than men twice her age. Her father ran a mule team that supplied the upper claims, and Mara had ridden the route since she could grip a saddle. She had not spoken much during the day's climb. She was thinking about the mule bell she had lost from the lead animal's collar 2 days earlier, broken free by a branch in the wind, and whether anyone up the drainage had heard it ringing in the dark and mistaken it for rescue. The thought made her sick. She would not learn the answer for 5 more days. On the 3rd day, Jory Pike stumbled into the lower camp. Jory was Ansel's younger brother, 28, strong-bodied, not stupid, but not careful. He had been sheltering in a dugout half a mile off the main trail, using green aspen splits and a rusted sheet iron stove that had no proper draft plate. When the wind shifted, the stove backdrafted and filled the dugout with smoke. Jory had kicked out the door and walked downhill in his shirt sleeves, expecting to reach the main trail in 10 minutes. He had walked for 3 hours. The snow was hip deep. The trail was invisible. He had crossed a creek without knowing it and sunk to his waist in water that froze his trousers stiff within minutes. By the time Rufus's dog found him crouching behind a boulder, Jory's lips were blue and he could not feel his hands. They warmed him, fed him, wrapped him in every spare cloth the party had. Jory survived because the party was there. If they had been one ridge farther, 1 day later, 1 mile higher, Jory Pike would have been a name carried down the mountain in spring. Rufus looked at Jory shivering by the greenwood fire and said nothing about practical men and their practical stoves. But Mara, watching from the edge of the firelight, understood something that the older men would not say aloud. Jory had done everything the mountain expected a man to do: cut wood, built fire, stoked it when it flagged, and the mountain had nearly killed him anyway. The conventional answer had failed. The greenwood, the brute force heating, the assumption that more fuel meant more survival, all of it had failed. Whatever Ewan Mercer was doing up in that cabin, Mara thought, it could not be worse than what had just happened here. She was half right. The 4th day inside the cabin was the day Ewan stopped thinking in words and started thinking in drops. His world had contracted to a circle with a radius of 6 feet, centered on the stove. Beyond that circle was cold he no longer tried to fight. The water cup was ice. The barrel crust was frozen hard enough to require the back of the awl to crack. The door had sealed itself with a rim of ice along the bottom hinge, which meant he could not open it without chipping the ice free, which meant he had stopped opening it. The air was bad. He knew it was bad because his headaches had become constant and his vision narrowed at the edges when he stood too quickly. The grease smoke, even with the chimney drawing, left a residue in his lungs that made each breath taste of soot and old fat. He coughed in fits that bent him double and left his ribs aching, but the stove held. The drip had become his entire existence. He no longer adjusted it consciously. His hands knew the rhythm, the way a musician's hands know strings after years of practice. When the drop sounded wrong, too heavy, too light, too close to the last, his fingers moved to the wire before his mind registered why. When the smoke shifted color, his other hand moved to the draft plate. He did not decide these things. They happened the way breathing happens because the body has accepted a task that the mind can no longer supervise. He ate the last of the hardtack on the 4th day, the elk strip he saved. He did not know why. Perhaps because having one piece of food left meant he was not yet at zero, and not zero was different from zero in a way that mattered more than calories. The 5th day brought a silence so complete that Ewan heard the ice crystals forming on the inside of the north wall. A faint, high sound, like something very small and very sharp being pressed into wood. The frost had advanced to within 3 feet of the stove. The dry patch around the stovepipe collar had shrunk to the size of a dinner plate. Beyond that plate, the world was ice. But within that plate, the iron was warm. The stove side, when he pressed his cheek against it, was hot enough to hurt. The drops fell and flared, and the air within the 6-foot circle stayed above the line where a man's lungs stopped working. A quart of strained grease, he had learned, lasted longer than he had imagined, far longer than a panful dumped too quickly, which was what instinct told a cold man to do. The slow feed stretched each quart across hours instead of minutes. The barrel had perhaps 30 gallons left. He did not know how many days that represented because the rate changed with the temperature, the wind, the chimney draw, and a dozen other variables his numb mind could not calculate. He knew only that the barrel was not empty and the stove was not cold, and that those two facts were the only ones that mattered. On the sixth day, the wind changed. It came from the west now, hard and steady, and it brought something worse than cold. It brought pressure. The air in the cabin thickened, and the chimney's draw weakened. Smoke that had been rising cleanly began to linger near the ceiling, building a gray layer that crept lower hour by hour. Ewan opened the draft plate wider, then to full open, and still the smoke thickened. He was being poisoned, not by the cold, by the air. Torsten's voice, tired now, worn down by 6 days of being dead and still needed. If it roars without listening, it is wasting itself. Ewan did not roar. He reduced. He narrowed the drip to the slowest rate that still produced flame. He slid the draft plate to a quarter open and let the fire thin to a blue pulse that was barely visible. The smoke thinned. The heat dropped. The frost advanced another 6 inches. He was trading warmth for breathable air and hoping the trade would hold until the wind shifted again. It held. Barely. The frost crept to within 2 feet of the stove. His breath came in shallow pulls that he rationed like fuel, taking only enough to stay conscious, spending none on coughing or cursing or calling out to a world that was not listening. On the 7th morning, a sound woke him. He had slept. He did not know for how long, minutes or an hour. The drip was still falling. The stove was still warm. The system, built on wire and grease and the memory of a dead blacksmith, had held through his unconsciousness like a heart beating through sleep. The sound came again, from outside. Footsteps. Not the bell, not the wind, not a branch cracking under snow weight. Footsteps. The specific rhythmic squeal of rawhide snowshoes compressing a frozen crust. And voices. Ewan lay on the bunk and listened. His body would not move fast enough to reach the door, and he no longer trusted sounds from outside. The mule bell had taught him that the mountain could lie, but the voices grew louder, and one of them said a word that the wind could not have invented. His name. Mercer. Ewan Mercer. He opened his mouth. The sound that came out was not his voice. It was a rasp, dry and broken, forced through a throat coated with 6 days of grease smoke, but it was loud enough. The door shuddered, snow cracked, iron hinges screamed as someone put a shoulder to the wood from outside and shoved. Light hit him, gray, flat, winter light, the most beautiful light he had ever seen, and with it came cold that made the cabin's cold feel domestic. A man's shape filled the doorway. Behind the man, more shapes, the sound of snowshoes, a mule snorting in protest. Rufus Bell stepped into the cabin, ducked under the smoke layer, and stopped. The stove was alive. The room was streaked with soot. The smell was beyond description. Grease, smoke, sweat, charred iron, and something else, something chemical and sharp that came from days of fat burning on metal without rest. A pail hung from wire above the stove, and from the pail, as Rufus watched, a single drop fell through dark air and struck the stovetop. It flared. A small, bright snap of yellow in the gloom. Drop, hiss, flare. Rufus looked at the empty wood box. He looked at the barrel against the wall. He looked at the wire, the cloth filter, the scored and sooted stovetop, the charred cradle, the awl hanging from a nail. He looked at Ewan Mercer, lying on the bunk with swollen hands and a swollen ankle and a face black with soot, breathing in shallow pulls that said his lungs had paid for every hour. "You are alive?" Rufus said. Ewan said nothing. He was not sure it was true yet. Behind Rufus, Mara Keene pressed into the doorway. She saw the smoke, the grease, the wire, the drops. She saw the frost on the walls and the dry patch around the stove where the frost had been pushed back. She saw the water cup on the shelf, the ice melted to slush on the side nearest the stove. She smelled the air and tasted it, and understood that a man had been breathing this for a week and was still breathing. She looked at the pail. A drop formed at the hole, hung, fell. The stove answered with a hiss and a small light. Drop, hiss, light. The sound that had kept Ewan Mercer alive was the sound Rufus Bell had heard before the door opened, the sound that had made him raise his hand and silence the entire party. A slow, steady pulse from inside a buried cabin that should have held nothing but a frozen body and 3 logs worth of ash. Drop, hiss, light. Ewan closed his eyes. The voices were real. The hands that lifted him were real. The cold air from the open door hit his face, and he did not fight it because for the first time in 7 days, cold air meant there were people on the other side of it. The 3 logs were ash. The barrel was not empty. The stove was warm. And outside, Mara Keene stood in the snow and watched black smoke curl from a chimney that every practical, experienced, knowledgeable person in the district had assumed would be cold. They carried him out on a litter made from snowshoe frames and a horse blanket, but Ewan refused to go farther than the shed. He would not leave the cabin. Rufus argued. Mara argued. Ewan shook his head and pointed at the stove. "The fire is still running," he said. His voice sounded like gravel dragged across tin. "We will build you a proper fire," Rufus said. "We brought wood. The drip is still running. If it stops and the iron cools, I have to start over, and I have nothing to start with." Rufus stared at him. The logic was absurd and irrefutable at the same time. The man had kept himself alive for 7 days on grease and wire, and now he would not leave the machine that had done it because the machine was still working, and he did not trust anything else. They compromised. Rufus's men hauled split pine from the mule packs and stacked it beside the stove. They fed the fire properly, real wood, dry, cut to length, and the cabin filled with the unfamiliar luxury of a heat that did not require counting. The drip pail hung empty and still on its wire above the stove. Ewan watched it the way a man watches a partner after a fight, with gratitude and exhaustion and something close to disbelief. Mara brought him water. Clean water, snow melt from a pot heated over the rescue party's fire, tasting of nothing but itself. He drank it in small sips that hurt his smoke-raw throat. She brought elk jerky, which he chewed slowly. She did not ask questions. She sat on the stool and looked at the stove, the wire, the barrel, the sooted walls, and the dry patch where the frost had retreated, and she catalogued everything she saw with the quiet attention of a woman who had grown up counting loads and reading trail conditions for a living. What she noticed first was the melted ice. The north wall, which should have been frozen solid, showed a band of wet wood starting about 2 feet from the stove and extending to the floor. Water ran in slow lines down the logs, pooling on the packed earth floor where it refroze into a thin skin of ice. The stove's heat had pushed the frost back far enough to melt the wall's inner surface. That was not supposed to be possible with 3 logs worth of fuel. Mara knew cabin heat the way she knew mule loads by the numbers. 3 logs could not melt a frozen wall. Something else had done it, and the something else was hanging from a wire above the stove with a hole punched in its bottom. Rufus came back inside after settling the mules. He stood beside the stove and placed his bare hand on the iron side. He pulled it back. The stove was hot. Not warm, not residual. Hot. The iron held the kind of heat that came from sustained combustion, not from a fire that had burned 3 logs and quit. Rufus looked at the empty wood box. He looked at the barrel. He looked at the wire, the pail, the soot-blackened stovetop scored with 100 carbon rings where drops had landed and flared and consume themselves. "I told you a man needed a cord," Rufus said quietly. Ewan, propped on the bunk with his ankle wrapped in wet cloth, met his eyes. "You were right." Rufus touched the pail. He traced the wire to the roof spike. He bent and looked at the hole, which was caked with residue. He straightened and looked at the barrel again, as if counting the gallons against the days and trying to make the math work in his head. "But you found something that burned slower than my certainty," Rufus said. He did not smile. Rufus Bell did not smile at things that had nearly killed a man, but something in his expression shifted. The line between his brows eased, and his jaw loosened, and his eyes moved from Ewan's face to the stove with a look that was not admiration but recognition. He was seeing something he had not thought possible, and the seeing cost him a piece of what he had known to be true. That was what conversion looked like, not a dramatic reversal, a quiet adjustment. A man who had been certain finding room for the possibility that certainty had a blind spot. Ansel Pike arrived 3 days later after the trail party had beaten a narrow path through the lower avalanche debris. Ansel came not to check on Ewan, but to find his brother. Jory had been brought down to the lower camp by Rufus's men, frostbitten and shaking, and the news had reached Ansel's trapping shelter through a relay of shouted messages across a valley. Ansel had snowshoed down, found Jory alive but missing sensation in 4 fingers, and spent 2 days in a fury that had no proper target. The mountain had nearly killed his brother, and fury at a mountain is a useless expenditure. So the fury found Ewan instead, or tried to. Ansel came up the trail to the cabin with the intention of confirming what he already believed, that Ewan Mercer had survived by luck, by some accident of cabin placement or wind pattern that had nothing to do with a barrel of rancid grease. Ansel needed the survival to be luck, because if it was not luck, then it was knowledge, and if it was knowledge, then Ansel's practical certainty that grease could not heat a house had been wrong, and wrong was a word Ansel Pike avoided the way superstitious men avoid broken mirrors. He walked inside. Ewan was sitting up now, his ankle braced with a splint Mara had fashioned from stove wood, his hands wrapped in clean cloth. The stove burned real pine. The pail hung empty. Ansel looked around the way Rufus had looked around, at the soot, the residue, the wire, the barrel. But where Rufus had been quiet, Ansel was blunt. "Show me," he said. "Show you what?" "Show me how a barrel of rancid fat kept a man alive for 7 days when my brother nearly died 2 miles downhill with a proper stove and cut wood." Ewan did not point out that Jory's wood had been green aspen and his stove had no draft plate. That would have been an attack on Ansel's family, and Ewan understood that Ansel was not here to be corrected. He was here to understand. The bluntness was not hostility. It was the sound a practical man makes when the world has stopped matching his predictions. Ewan talked him through it, not as a lecture, as a tour. He pointed at the pail and explained the hole. He pointed at the wire and explained the suspension. He pointed at the stovetop and showed Ansel the scored ring where the drops had landed, a circle of carbon residue the size of a silver dollar, darker than the surrounding iron, worn smooth by a week of tiny combustion events. "The grease falls slow," Ewan said. "Each drop hits iron that is hot enough to flash it. The flash keeps the iron hot. The hot iron keeps the next drop flashing. It feeds itself as long as the draft is right and the grease is warm enough to flow." Ansel crouched beside the stove and looked at the scored ring. He touched it with one finger. It was rough, textured, the way iron gets when it has been heated and cooled and heated again 1,000 times in the same spot. "What happens if you feed too fast?" Ansel asked. "It pools, smokes, smothers the heat, or flares too high. Too slow? The iron cools between drops. The grease lands on warm iron instead of hot. It smears, does not catch. And the chimney fouls with soot, has to be cleared every few hours, or the draw weakens and the smoke comes back. Ansel stood up. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My brother burned green aspen with a full draft and a strong back, and the smoke drove him into the snow. You burned rancid bear fat with a cracked pail and a wire, and the smoke stayed in the chimney." "Not always," Ewan said. "The smoke came back plenty. I just did not leave when it did." Ansel looked at him. Something behind his eyes was rearranging itself, not fast, not with any visible surrender, but the practical mind that had dismissed the barrel at Keen's trading room was incorporating new information the way practical minds always do, reluctantly, honestly, one fact at a time. "My brother could have died," Ansel said. "He almost did." "Your method, could it have helped him? A controlled burn with dense fuel and proper draft, against green wood and no plate?" Ewan paused. "It could have given him a chance. Whether he would have had the patience to run it, that is a different question." Ansel nodded slowly. He did not say he had been wrong. He did not need to. The nod said it, the way a practical man says things through motion rather than words. He left. He came back the next day with 2 cleaned marten pelts and a sack of dried beans. He set them on the shelf without comment and left again. That was Ansel Pike's apology, and it was worth more than any words he could have spoken, because it was given in the only language he respected, material help, delivered without explanation. Word spread the way things spread in mountain districts, through relay, repetition, and distortion. By the time the story reached the lower settlements, Ewan Mercer had survived a month on bear grease. It was 7 days. Heated a cabin large enough for a family. It was a single room, and invented a stove that ran on kitchen waste. It was a pail with a hole. The distortions did not matter. What mattered was the core truth underneath them. A man with no wood had kept warm using something everyone else threw away. Miners asked about it at Keen's. Teamsters mentioned it on the road. Women who managed cabin heat as a daily practice rather than a seasonal emergency listened with particular attention. A widow from a nearby gulch heard the story from Mara Keen's father, who had heard it from Rufus, who had stood in the cabin and felt the stove. The widow's name was Clara Voss. She was 31, German-born, sharp-featured, with a 5-year-old son named Willem, who had not been fully well since autumn. Clara's husband had died in a shaft collapse the previous spring, leaving her a cabin, 2 goats, a shotgun, and no income. She survived on trade, garden remnants, and the kind of fierce economy that people admire from a distance and never want to practice. Clara arrived at Ewan's cabin on a March afternoon with Willem on her hip and a bucket of rancid cooking fat in her free hand. She set the bucket on the ground and looked at Ewan, who was standing in the doorway with a splint on his ankle and soot still in the creases of his neck. "I heard you can make heat from what everyone else throws away," Clara said. Ewan looked at the bucket. He looked at the child. Willem's face was thin, and his breathing had a faint whistle at the bottom of each exhale that Ewan recognized, the sound of lungs that were working too hard. "I can show you what I did," Ewan said, "but I should show you what can go wrong first." Clara did not flinch. Women who have buried husbands in mine shafts do not flinch at warnings. They calculate. "Show me both," she said. Teaching Clara was different from explaining to Rufus or Ansel. Rufus had needed to see. Ansel had needed to challenge. Clara needed to learn, because Clara's survival depended not on understanding a principle, but on executing a method, alone, in a cabin with a child who could not afford smoke or cold. Ewan showed her the system cold. Stove unlit, pail empty, barrel closed. He walked her through the logic with the pail in her hands so she could feel the weight, the angle, the way the hole clogged and cleared. He showed her the draft plate and made her open and close it until she could feel the difference in airflow by holding her palm near the gap. Then he lit the stove with pine and ran the drip while she watched. He made her stand close enough to feel the heat pulse when each drop flared. He made her watch the smoke and name the color. Gray. She nodded. He fouled the draft deliberately by closing the plate too far. Black. She saw it. He opened the plate and the smoke thinned. She felt the temperature change as cold air entered. Too fast kills draft, he said. Too much smoke kills lungs. Too much heat near the barrel kills the cabin. He pointed at each thing as he named it. The grease is not safe. The stove is not safe. The smoke is not safe. What is safe is knowing which one will kill you first in any given moment and adjusting before it does. Clara listened the way she did everything, with total attention and no wasted motion. She asked 3 questions. How warm does the grease need to be before it flows? How often does the chimney need clearing? What does she do if the draft fails and she cannot open the door because the child is between her and the exit? The 3rd question was the one that mattered, because it was the question a mother asks, and it was the question Ewan had not faced. His cabin had no child in it. His risk calculations had been for one body, one pair of lungs, one set of decisions. Clara's calculations included a person who could not adjust the draft plate and whose lungs were already compromised. You keep the child on the far side of the cabin from the stove, Ewan said. You hang a wet cloth across the room at chest height. It catches some of the smoke before it spreads. And if the draft fails completely, you do not fix the chimney. You smother the drip, close the pail, and wrap the child. Cold is slower than smoke. Clara absorbed this. She picked up Willem, who had been sitting on the bunk watching the stove, with the calm attention of a child who has lived his entire short life in rooms where heat was the central concern of every adult around him. I will practice at my cabin before I need it, Clara said, and I will practice with the door open until I trust the chimney. She left with the bucket of fat and a scrap of wire Ewan cut for her. He watched her walk down the trail, a narrow back, a child's arm around her neck, a bucket swinging, and felt something he had not felt in months. Not hope, exactly. Responsibility. The weight of knowing that what he had learned could help someone, and the heavier weight of knowing it could hurt them if taught wrong. After the thaw came far enough to open the lower trails, Ewan made a walk he had owed the dead. Torsten Brecke's smithy sat on a flat beside the railroad siding outside Durango. A low stone and timber building with a sod roof and a chimney that had once produced the best repair work between Silverton and Farmington. Torsten had rented the space from the railroad for the cost of occasional ironwork on brake assemblies and coupling pins. When he died, the railroad had locked the door and forgotten about it. Ewan had not been back since the funeral, which had been attended by 4 men and a dog. Torsten had not been a man who accumulated friends. He had been a man who accumulated skills, and skills are admired but not loved in the way that earns a crowd at a graveside. The roof had collapsed. Spring snow, heavier than winter snow and carrying meltwater, had pushed through the weakened sod and broken the center beam. The forge stood open to the sky, its bellows rotted, its coal bed a puddle of black slurry. The anvil was still bolted to its stump, streaked with rust that turned the surface the color of old blood. The tuyere, the iron pipe that directed air into the forge heart, lay on its side in the rubble. Ewan stood in the wreckage and breathed the smell of wet iron and cold stone, and something else, something that was not a smell but a feeling, the absence of heat in a place that had been defined by it. He picked up the tuyere. It was heavy, cold, and perfectly made. The inside bore smooth, the flange still true. Torsten had forged it himself from a piece of salvaged locomotive pipe. and he had been proud of it in the way that craftsmen are proud of things that work better than they need to. Ewan cleaned the mud from it with his sleeve and held it in both hands. The forge mouth gaped at the sky. Snow lay in the ash bed. The bellows handles pointed upward like arms that had stopped reaching. Everything that had made this place alive, the heat, the rhythm, the cracked hands adjusting the draft, the low, steady voice explaining why iron behaved the way it did, was gone, not destroyed, dissolved. Carried away in the lungs of a man who had coughed it out in a rented room and left nothing behind but tools and a note folded under a floorboard. Ewan hung the tuyere over his shoulder and walked out. He did not look back. The smithy would rot. The anvil would rust into a monument that no one would visit. But the knowledge, draft discipline, metal memory, rhythm over force, the patient negotiation between fuel and air and iron that lived in Ewan's hands now, in the scored ring on his stovetop, in the wire cradle he had bent in the dark while counting drops against breaths. Torsten Breke was dead. What Torsten Breke knew was not. The secondary crisis arrived in April, when winter should have been finished but was not. A late storm, not unusual in the San Juan country, where spring was a rumor that the mountains heard and ignored, dropped 2 feet of wet snow on the lower drainages and sealed the trails again for 4 days. The storm was not an avalanche. It was not a killing freeze, but it was enough to trap Clara Voss and Willem in their cabin with an unreliable stove and a chimney that had been drawing poorly since a bird's nest lodged in the cap the previous autumn. Mara brought the word. She rode up the trail on the freight mule her father had spared, her face red with cold and effort, and told Ewan that Clara's fire kept dying. The wind funneled down the gulch and pressed on the chimney cap, and every gust snuffed the flame. Clara had tried Ewan's method, the drip, the pail, the wire, but the gusts killed the flash before it could sustain itself. The cabin was cold. Willem's breathing had worsened. Clara had sent Mara because Clara would not leave the child. Ewan's ankle was still weak. The trail to Clara's cabin was 2 miles through fresh snow with 1 steep drainage crossing. He went anyway, because the alternative was sitting in his warm cabin with a working stove while a child with bad lungs shivered in a room where every gust erased the heat. He arrived sweating and limping. Clara met him at the door with Willem wrapped in every cloth she owned. The boy's face was gray. His breathing whistled louder now, a sound that thinned Ewan's throat with fear because it was the sound of lungs that were losing a negotiation with air. The stove was cold. The pail hung from a length of twisted wire, a faithful copy of Ewan's design. The barrel of cooking fat sat against the wall. Everything was right. Everything except the chimney, which coughed every time the wind found the gulch angle, and the draft, which collapsed every time the chimney coughed. Ewan crouched beside the stove and thought. This was not his cabin. His cabin sat on a slope where the wind came from predictable angles, and the chimney rose above the ridgeline of the roof into open air. Clara's cabin sat in a hollow where wind compressed and swirled, and her chimney was shorter, blockier, and faced into the prevailing gusts like a mouth trying to breathe against a hand. The drip could not work if the draft could not hold. And the draft could not hold because the chimney was losing to the wind. Torsten had never taught him how to fix a chimney. Torsten had taught him something better. Torsten had taught him that when a system fails, you do not fix the failure. You change the condition that causes it. The wind was pressing down the chimney. He could not stop the wind, but he could change where the air entered the stove. If the draft plate was the only air source and the chimney was the only exit, then a gust that blocked the exit also blocked the intake, and the fire suffocated. But if there were a second intake, a small hole low on the stove body, below the grate, feeding air directly to the coal bed from the room rather than through the chimney circuit, then a gust might block the chimney exit without killing the fire underneath. Ewan used Torsten's awl. He punched two small holes in the lower front panel of Clara's stove, below the draft plate, each the size of his little finger. The holes were crude. They would let ash fall through. They would make the stove harder to control in normal conditions, but they gave the fire a way to breathe that did not depend on the chimney pulling. He lit the stove with Clara's last dry kindling, built a small coal bed, and started the drip. When the first gust hit the chimney and the flue coughed, the flame dimmed but did not die. The low holes pulled room air into the coal bed, and the coals held enough heat to flash the next drop. The smoke rolled back, thinner than before, and when the gust passed, the chimney recovered. It was not clean. It was not elegant. The smoke was worse than in Ewan's cabin, and Clara would need to manage it carefully. But the fire held through the next gust, and the next, and the next. Willem's corner of the cabin had the wet cloth hung across at chest height, catching the worst of the smoke. Clara sat beside the boy and watched the stove with the focused attention Ewan recognized, the attention of a person who has accepted that survival is not a state, but a practice, a continuous set of adjustments that never stop requiring the next one. The storm lasted 3 more days. Clara ran the drip through all 3. She cleared the chimney twice. She managed the smoke with the cloth and the door and the draft plate and the 2 ugly holes Ewan had punched in her stove. Willem's breathing did not improve, but it did not worsen. The cabin stayed warm enough that water did not freeze within the child's reach. On the 4th day, the storm broke and Mara arrived with food and dry wood. Clara doused the drip, opened the door, and let clean air flood the cabin for the first time in 4 days. Willem looked up at the sudden brightness and coughed once, hard, and then breathed deeper than he had breathed in a week. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built from things other people overlook. Calvin Strake heard about Clara. Strake heard about everything, because men who hold paper on other men's claims develop the hearing of predators, tuned to vulnerability, alert to any shift in the balance between debtor and creditor, between occupied and abandoned, between alive and dead. What Strake heard was that Ewan Mercer was teaching people to burn grease in their stoves. What Strake calculated was that a method spreading through the district changed the value of every cabin it reached. A cabin that could be heated in an emergency was harder to condemn as abandoned. A claim holder who could survive a bad week was harder to squeeze out. Ewan's grease drip, if it spread, was not just a survival trick. It was an obstacle to the economics that Strake had built his entire position on, the assumption that winter killed the marginal, and the marginal's claims could be bought for nothing. Strake went to the sheriff. Not with a complaint against Ewan. Ewan had done nothing illegal, but with a concern. Grease fires, cabin fires. Women and children burned because a desperate man had taught them to drip rancid fat onto hot iron in a closed room. Strake framed it as public safety. He was not entirely wrong. The method was dangerous. The method could burn a cabin down if mishandled. The method could fill a room with smoke that killed before the cold did. The sheriff, a tired man named Pratt, who had enough real crime to occupy his time, told Strake that if no one had been hurt, there was no case. Strake pressed. He suggested the cabin be inspected and condemned as a fire hazard. Pratt told him to file a written complaint with the county clerk and left. Strake did not file a complaint. Filing left a paper trail, and paper trails could be read by people who might notice that the man filing fire safety complaints was the same man who held notes on 3 of the 5 cabins he wanted condemned. Instead, Strake went to the people. He visited Keene's trading room and spoke loudly about the danger of amateur stove modification. He mentioned smoke inhalation. He mentioned children. He mentioned the word liable in the context of a man teaching an unproven method to people who did not understand the risks. He did not accuse Ewan directly. He created an atmosphere of doubt, the kind of doubt that spreads through a small community the way frost spreads through a cabin wall, slowly, from the edges inward. Some people listened. The method was genuinely frightening if you had not seen it work. Dripping grease onto a hot stove sounded insane to anyone who had ever seen a grease fire in a kitchen. The fact that it had worked for Ewan under desperate conditions did not mean it would work for a trapper's wife with 2 children and a stove she barely understood. Ansel Pike, to his credit, pushed back. "The man survived 7 days with no wood," Ansel said at the counter. "My brother nearly died in one night with a full wood pile and a proper stove. If Mercer's method is dangerous, what do you call Jory's?" Strake smiled. "I call it conventional, and conventional has the virtue of being understood." "Understood by who?" "Jory understood how to cut wood and feed a fire, and the smoke nearly killed him." Strake did not respond. He had planted what he needed to plant and left the store, but the doubt was in the air now, mixing with the genuine admiration that Ewan's survival had produced. People who had been curious became cautious. People who had been cautious became afraid. And people who had been afraid became the material that Strake needed for what he planned next, a public demonstration. Strake proposed it at Keen's the following week, framing it as a community safety measure. Let Mercer show his method in the open, with people watching, so everyone could see for themselves whether it was practical or reckless. If it worked, he said, then fine. Let people use it at their own risk. If it failed or smoked or flared or showed any sign of the danger Strake had been whispering about, then the community could make an informed decision. It was a trap dressed as fairness. Strake knew that a public demonstration amplified every flaw. A drip that stuttered in private became a disaster in front of an audience. A puff of smoke that Ewan could manage alone became panic when 30 people were watching. And if anything went wrong, anything at all, Strake would have witnesses to support a condemnation. The word reached Ewan through Mara, who had heard it from her father, who had heard it from Keen. "He wants you to fail in public," Mara said. "I know." "Then why would you do it?" Ewan looked at the stove, the wire, the pail. He looked at the barrel, which was down to perhaps 20 gallons, but which had kept him alive when nothing else could. He thought about Clara and Willem. He thought about Jory Pike shivering behind a boulder with frozen trousers. He thought about the next winter, which would come the way winters always came in the San Juans, without warning, without mercy, and without regard for whether a man was ready. "Because if I do not show them," he said, "they will learn it wrong from someone else. And wrong kills faster than ignorance." Mara stared at him for a long moment. Then she pulled a freight ledger from her coat, a battered book with canvas covers and ruled pages, and opened it to a blank sheet. "Then we keep records," she said. "Weather, grease used, chimney condition, temperature by the water freeze test, everything that works and everything that nearly killed you. If Strake wants a demonstration, we give him one he cannot dismiss, because the numbers will be on the page where anyone can read them." Ewan looked at the ledger. He looked at Mara. He saw a woman who understood that truth without documentation is rumor, and rumor loses to money every time. "All right," he said. "We keep records." The demonstration took place on a Saturday in late May at the flat ground behind Keen's trading room, where freight wagons turned around and mules were loaded. It was not a warm day. The San Juans do not produce warm days in May at altitude. They produce bright days with a cold edge, the kind where the sun heats your face while the air freezes your knuckles, and a man can stand in both seasons at once. Ewan had insisted on conditions. He would not perform a spectacle. He would demonstrate the method with a cold stove, from the beginning, the way a person who had never seen it would need to learn it. He would explain the dangers first. He would show what happened when it went wrong before he showed what happened when it went right. Rufus Bell stood beside him, not as a supporter, but as a witness. Rufus had made it clear that he would confirm what he had seen in Ewan's cabin and nothing more. 30 people came. Miners, trappers, teamsters, 3 women including Clara Voss, several children kept at the edge by mothers who did not yet know whether they were watching a lesson or a fire. Ansel Pike stood near the back with his arms crossed and his brother Jory beside him. Jory's right hand was wrapped in cloth that hid the stumps where 2 fingers had been. Marrakeen stood to Ewan's left with the freight ledger open. Calvin Strake stood at the front. He had dressed for the occasion, clean coat, good boots, the careful appearance of a man who represented stability and caution. His expression was concerned, civic, the face of a neighbor worried about safety. Only Ewan knew what the face was actually calculating. Ewan began by holding up the pail. "This can kill you," he said. The crowd shifted. That was not the opening they expected. "The grease in this barrel can kill you. The smoke from the stove can kill you. The heat that keeps you alive can also burn your cabin down and everyone in it." He set the pail on the stove top. "I am not here to tell you this method is safe. It is not safe. I am here to tell you what it does, how it fails, and why you would use it only when every other choice is worse." He talked through the system the way he had talked Clara through it, cold, piece by piece, holding each component so the audience could see it. The pail, the hole, the wire, the draft plate, the barrel kept away from the stove, the cloth filter, the small working quantity. He explained the flash point. He explained the smoke colors. He explained what happened when the draft failed, when the chimney clogged, when the grease pooled. Then he lit the stove. He built a small fire with split pine, 2 sticks, not a full load, and let the stove body heat. While it heated, he strained grease through the cloth and filled the pail. He hung the pail on the wire and waited. The crowd was silent. 30 people watching a bucket drip grease onto a stove in a freight yard on a cold May morning, and not one of them looked away. The first drop fell. It hit the iron and smoked. The second drop fell. It smoked and then flared, a small, bright snap that drew a murmur from the crowd. "That is the flash," Ewan said. "Each drop carries heat. The stove carries heat. When they meet, the grease burns. When the grease burns, it keeps the iron hot enough to burn the next drop." He pointed at the smoke. "Gray is clean. Watch for black." He let the drip run. The rhythm established itself, the same rhythm Ewan had counted through 7 days of darkness, now visible in daylight, audible to 30 people who had never heard it before. Drop, hiss, flare, drop, hiss, flare. Rufus stepped forward and placed his hand near the stove side. He held it there, then pulled it back. "Hot," he said. "The same heat I felt in his cabin. The wood was gone. The stove was hot." The crowd murmured again. Strake spoke. His voice was calm, reasonable, the voice of a man asking questions the audience should be asking. "How fast can you push it? If a family is freezing, they want heat fast. Show us what happens at a faster rate." Ewan looked at Strake. He understood the move. A faster rate meant more grease, which meant more smoke, which meant the audience would see the method at its worst. A faster rate also risked a flare, a visible burst of fire that would frighten people who were already nervous. "No," Ewan said. "Why not?" "Because faster is how people die. The method works at this rate. This rate keeps the iron hot and the smoke manageable. A man who pushes the rate because he is cold or scared or impatient will pool grease on the stove, and pooled grease flares. I will not demonstrate a flare to prove a point." Strake smiled. The smile said, "He is afraid of his own method." "Then I will show them," Strake said, and reached for the pail wire. What happened next took 3 seconds. Strake pulled the pail down and tilted it. A pour of grease, not a drip, a pour, hit the stovetop. The liquid spread across the hot iron in a sheet. For a half second, nothing happened. Then the sheet ignited. The flare was not small. It was a bloom of yellow fire that rose a foot above the stove surface, bright enough to throw shadows in daylight, hot enough that the people closest to the stove stepped back. Someone shouted. A child screamed. The smoke that followed was black and thick and rolled outward like a living thing. Rufus moved first. He slammed the draft plate shut, cutting the air supply. The flare thinned but did not die. The pooled grease on the stovetop had enough heat to sustain itself without draft. Ewan grabbed a shovel that was leaning against the trading post wall, scooped a load of sandy dirt from the freight yard, and threw it across the stovetop. The dirt smothered the flame. Smoke billowed. The fire died. 5 seconds, start to finish. Ewan turned to Strake. His face was blackened with soot. His hands were steady. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent crowd the way a clear sentence carries in a room where everyone has stopped breathing. That, Ewan said, is what happens when a man who does not understand the method forces it past its limits. Strake's face had changed. The civic concern was gone. The careful appearance was gone. What remained was the face of a man who had expected a small failure, a cough of smoke, a stutter in the drip, and had instead created a fire that required a shovel and a slam draft to contain. He had meant to embarrass Ewan, and had instead demonstrated, in front of every person in the district who mattered, exactly the danger that Ewan had warned about, and exactly the composure with which Ewan and Rufus had handled it. The crowd saw. They saw who had caused the flare and who had controlled it. They saw who had panicked and who had not. Ansel Pike, from the back, said what the crowd was thinking. "Tell them what happens if they get it wrong, Mercer." Ewan nodded. "If you get it wrong, it does what you just saw. Fire that you cannot control, smoke that fills a room, heat that goes from saving your life to ending it. This method is not a replacement for firewood. It is not a trick. It is a last resort, and a last resort demands respect." He paused. The stove sat under a coating of dirty sand, the pail still swinging from Strake's grab. The crowd was motionless. "If you want to learn it, come to my cabin. I will teach you one at a time with the door open and a sand bucket beside the stove. I will show you what I showed Clara Voss, the wrong way first, so you know what kills you, and the right way second, so you know what saves you." Rufus Bell looked at Strake. Strake was standing 3 paces from the stove, his hands at his sides, his clean coat spotted with soot. The crowd looked at Strake too, and what they saw was not a concerned neighbor. What they saw was a man who had grabbed a wire he did not understand and created the exact catastrophe he had claimed to be preventing. Rufus said, "No insurer dug him out either." It was not a killing blow. It was worse. It was a dismissal. Rufus turned his back on Strake and walked to where Ewan was wiping sand from the stovetop, and the turning of that back said everything the district needed to hear about whose judgment could be trusted. Strake left the demonstration without speaking. He did not file the condemnation complaint. He did not return to Keen's trading room for 2 weeks. When he did, the talk had moved on. The talk was about Ewan Mercer's cabin, about Clara Voss keeping her son warm through a spring storm, about Mara Keen's ledger with its careful columns of weather and fuel and temperature. The talk was no longer about whether the method worked. The talk was about how to learn it without getting killed. Strake's claim pressure weakened because the people who mattered, Rufus, Mara, Ansel, Clara, all testified that Ewan's occupied cabin and improvements were legitimate. The note still existed. The debt still existed. But the leverage was gone, because a man who had survived 7 days on grease and wire and had taught others to do the same was not a man a county judge would allow to be called an abandoner. Strake muttered that no sane underwriter would approve the method. He was probably right, but no underwriter had ever spent a week above the Animas in February, and the people who had were no longer listening to Calvin Strake. The teaching came slowly, the way trust comes in places where mistakes are fatal. Ewan did not hold classes. He brought people to the cabin, one family at a time, and showed them the system the way Torsten had shown him the forge, through action, through failure, through the patient repetition of steps until the hands understood what the mind could not explain. He taught Clara Voss to judge smoke by smell before she could see it change color. He taught Rufus Bell to feel chimney draft through a wetted finger at the cleanout gap. He taught Ansel Pike, grudgingly practically, with the minimum of words that two stubborn men could manage, how to calculate grease reserve against days of isolation. Ansel, in turn, taught Ewan something Ewan had not known, how to render bare fat cleaner, separating the brown sediment that clogged the drip hole from the clearer fat above it. The exchange was not charity. It was trade between men who respected each other's knowledge without needing to say so. Mara kept the ledger. Every lesson, every test, every failure went into the ruled pages. Weather conditions, grease quantity, chimney state, stove temperature by the water freeze test, a cup of water placed at measured distances from the stove, checked hourly. How far from the stove did the water stay liquid? That distance was the survival radius. Everything inside it was life. Everything outside it was the mountains. The ledger became the method's memory. When Ewan forgot a detail, the ledger held it. When a trapper's wife 3 gulches over asked whether cooking fat worked as well as bear grease, Mara could open the book and show the numbers from Clara's test. Slightly lower heat per drop, slightly more smoke, but functional. When Rufus added chimney brushes and wire and sand buckets to his winter road caches, it was because Mara's ledger showed which supplies had prevented the 3 worst incidents of the spring. The ledger was not a scientific document. It was a freight record applied to fire, and it worked because Mara understood that information people could see was stronger than information people had to believe. By summer, the teaching had spread past the upper drainage. It did not spread as a movement or an invention. It spread the way practical knowledge spreads in mountain country. Through word passed from one person to the next, modified with each telling, adapted to each cabin, each stove, each chimney, each particular configuration of wind and wall and fuel supply. Some families never used the drip at all. Some used grease only as emergency starter fuel when wet wood would not catch. Some learned only the broader principle, the one Torsten had taught and Ewan had translated into survival, that heat was not measured by the woodpile alone. It was measured by draft, fuel density, chimney condition, and the time between help and isolation. Widows saved waste fat instead of discarding it. Trappers rendered grease more carefully, separating the clean from the foul. Teamsters added small emergency fuel tins to their pack lists, not because they planned to drip grease onto stoves, but because they had heard that dense fuel, carefully managed, could buy hours that wood alone could not. Rufus Bell insisted that every winter road cache between Silverton and the upper claims contain a chimney brush, a length of wire, and a bucket of sand. The mountain did not become less dangerous, but the people on it became slightly less alone in their danger, and the distance between survival and death, always thin in the San Juans, widened by the margin of a few gallons of fat and the knowledge of how to use them. Mara Keene did not fall in love with Ewan Mercer. She decided to work with him, and the work produced something that neither of them named until it was too obvious to ignore. Their courtship happened in the language of the mountain, through tasks shared, arguments survived, and competence tested. Mara hauled clean sand to the cabin and stockpiled it in buckets beside the stove. Ewan showed her how to read the stove's temperature by the color of the iron, the way Torsten had shown him. They argued about whether Ewan took too many risks. Mara thought he did. Ewan thought he was careful. And they were both right in the way that people who care about each other's survival are always both right. Mara stopped riding her father's freight route at the end of summer. She moved her belongings to a lean-to she built against Ewan's shed, not into his cabin, because Mara was practical enough to know that a woman who moves into a man's cabin before marriage becomes the subject of the kind of talk that costs a woman freight contracts. The lean-to was hers. The work was theirs. The line between them blurred slowly, the way a trail blurs when enough feet walk it. They married in the autumn, in a ceremony attended by Rufus Bell, Ansel Pike, Clara Voss, Willem, Old Keen, Mara's father, and the dog that still followed Rufus. The ceremony was brief. Ewan had no ring. Mara did not want one. What she wanted, she said afterward, was a cabin that did not smell like rancid fat, and Ewan laughed for the first time since before the avalanche, a real laugh, startled out of him, the sound of a man who had forgotten that he could. By the early 1890s, the cabin had grown. Not dramatically, a second room, a better stove with a proper draft gate, a root cellar, but enough that people passing on the wagon road stopped to rest, warm themselves, and ask questions. Ewan and Mara did not charge for the stop. They charged for repair work, stove maintenance, chimney cleaning, draft plate fitting, the practical iron work that Ewan had learned from Torsten and refined through 2 winters of teaching. People began calling the place Mercer's Warm Stop. Ewan did not like the name. Mara said it was better than what the freight drivers called it, which was the grease cabin. The name stuck. Their daughter Ada was born in the spring of 1891. Mara chose the name not for sentiment, but for practicality, a short name that could be shouted over wind and heard clearly across a yard. Ada Mercer grew up in a cabin where heat was a conversation, not a given, and where every adult she knew understood that fire was something borrowed, not something owned. The silver crash of 1893 wounded the district. Mines closed, families left. The wagon road thinned. Ewan and Mara stayed longer than most because their work had shifted from mining supply to winter survival, stove repair, chimney fitting, fuel assessment, and the steady, unglamorous labor of helping people prepare for a season that would always come and would never be gentle. Ewan's burned hand never fully opened in cold weather. The scar tissue across his palm contracted when the temperature dropped, pulling his fingers into a half-curl that ached in the way old injuries ache, not sharply, but constantly, a reminder that the body keeps accounts the mind would rather forget. He kept Torsten's awl above the stove, polished by years of smoke and the casual touch of a hand reaching up to confirm it was still there. He died in 1911 in the spring, after a lung illness that had been building for years. The smoke, the grease vapor, the decades of iron dust and cabin soot. His lungs had paid the price his hands had negotiated, and the payment came due on an April morning when the air was clean and warm and his body could no longer use it. Mara found the awl still hanging above the stove. She took it down, cleaned it with a cloth, and put it in the freight ledger, the same ledger she had opened on a May morning behind Keen's trading room, the one that held every number, every test, every failure, and every survival the method had produced over 23 years of mountain winters. By the time Ewan Mercer's method spread through the gulches, it had changed shape. Some families never used a drip. Some used grease only as a starting fuel on bad nights. But the deeper lesson traveled farther than the technique. Do not measure winter by the woodpile alone. Measure it by heat, draft, fuel density, chimney condition, and the distance between your cabin and help that may not come. Clara Voss taught mothers to save fat cleanly and store it sealed against the smell. Rufus Bell added grease tins and chimney wire to every road cache between the forks. Ansel Pike, who once said Ewan would smoke himself black, became the man who warned newcomers that mockery burns no warmer than pride. Ewan lived out his later years near the same mountain road that nearly killed him. He never became rich. His claim never turned into a great mine. What he built was stranger and harder to name. A cabin people walked toward when the weather turned ugly, a ledger full of numbers that told the truth about fire and cold, and a reputation that rested not on success, but on the honest teaching of a method that could save a life or end one, depending on whether the person using it had been taught by someone who respected the danger. When his lungs failed in 1911, Mara found Torsten's awl still hanging above the stove, worn smooth by smoke, and 20 years of a man's hand reaching up to touch what was left of his teacher. February 1887. 3 logs beside the stove, frost creeping inward, wind pressing against the chimney like a hand over a mouth. Rufus Bell had stood in the doorway and said, "You need a cord, not scraps." He had been right. Ewan did need more wood. He needed money, credit, neighbors close enough to hear him call, and a winter that left the road open long enough for a man to be something other than alone. He had none of those things. What he had was 3 logs, a barrel of foul grease, and the memory of an old blacksmith who had taught him that heat was not something a man owned. It was something he borrowed, guarded, and spent one careful breath at a time. The last image is not a roaring fire. It is a single drop falling through dark cabin air, catching the dull red of the stove's iron skin, and becoming light, small, brief, sufficient before the cold can take it.